Daniel adjusted the tie precisely, making sure the knot was perfectly aligned with the collar of his crisp shirt. It was 6:45 a.m., and his routine was a perfectly rehearsed choreography. 5-minute shower, black coffee without sugar, and reviewing the financial markets before leaving. He knew exactly how long it would take him to get to the office, and as always, his watch was right when he walked through the doors of the glass building where he worked. At 38 years old, Daniel was a successful man. A financial analyst at one of the most prestigious firms in the city, he had the life that many would envy. A modern apartment in the center, a luxury car, and a bank account that reflected years of effort and discipline. His ability to analyze patterns, predict trends, and minimize risks had taken him far in his career. However, what he could not calculate or predict was the feeling of emptiness that became more evident with each passing year. He had learned to ignore it. After all, there was no point dwelling on abstract thoughts or unanswerable questions. For him, life should be logical, structured, and predictable. Luck did not exist, coincidences were just random data, and everything worthwhile had to be measurable. That morning, Daniel was attending a meeting with senior managers to discuss investment strategies. His team presented an analysis of the Asian market and its volatility in the last 5 years. While one of his colleagues presented graphs and trends, he mentally reviewed the details. He had reviewed each issue the night before. There was no margin for error. However, in the middle of the presentation, something caught his attention. On the large television screen in the meeting room, where economic news was normally broadcast, an advertisement for a documentary briefly appeared. He didn't pay much attention, but then he read a sentence that made him frown. Sometimes the answers are where you least expect them. Daniel felt a slight chill run down his spine. It was nonsense, a generic message like those that appear in any self-help movie. And yet, he couldn't help those words from sticking with him. He shook his head and looked away from the screen, returning his attention to the meeting. He mentally scolded himself for getting distracted. He had no time for cheap philosophies. Hours later, back in his office, he tried to continue with his day as usual. The meeting had been a success, and he now had a list of tasks to complete before the market closed. However, his concentration was failing. Why had that simple phrase caught his attention like that? It was absurd. Maybe he was tired. Maybe I just needed a vacation. But if he was honest with himself, he had been feeling this way for years. There were nights when he would stare at the ceiling of his room, feeling like something in his life was out of place, but unable to define what exactly it was. He massaged his temples and sighed. He had no time for distractions. Throughout the day, every time his mind wandered, that phrase would appear again. Sometimes the answers are where you least expect them. And although he tried to ignore it, something inside him knew that idea would not let him go so easily. That night, while eating dinner alone in his apartment, Daniel reflected on his life. He had sacrificed personal relationships for his career. He had no partner or close friends. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt real emotion about something. Life had been a series of logical and strategic decisions. But then, why did he feel like something was missing? He poured himself a glass of wine and turned on the television to distract himself. He changed channels mechanically until, without realizing it, he came to a documentary on Eastern philosophies. Just at that moment, the narrator said, "Synchronicity is the language of the universe. There are no coincidences, only signals waiting to be interpreted." Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. I didn't believe in those things. But what if ... No, he was getting carried away by irrational ideas. He turned off the television and went to bed. He tried to fall asleep, but the phrase he had read in the morning kept echoing in his mind. The sound of the coffee maker filled Daniel's apartment with a familiar aroma, but his mind was elsewhere. He had been trying for days to forget the phrase he had seen on television, but every time his mind relaxed, those words came back with force. Sometimes the answers are where you least expect them. He told himself it was nonsense. His life was not a self-help book or one of those stories that people tell to convince themselves that the universe has a purpose for everything. Life was numbers, logic, and calculated decisions, and yet, something inside him couldn't let it go. That afternoon, after an intense day at the office, Daniel received a message from his colleague and university friend, Marcos. "See you at the usual bar. I have something for you." Although at first he hesitated to accept, he ended up giving in. He needed to disconnect his mind from those irrational ideas that tormented him. When he arrived, Marcos was waiting for him with a cold beer and a carefree smile. "I brought you something. I saw it and thought of you." He handed her a book wrapped in brown paper. Daniel opened it curiously, revealing the cover. "The Path of Synchronicity, The Journey of a Lost Soul." He frowned. "Why did you think of me with this?" Mark shrugged. "I don't know, it just caught my attention." Additionally, he mentions a temple in Thailand that supposedly has answers for those seeking purpose. Daniel felt a chill. Thailand? Yes, Wat Phao Luang Tabua Temple. "I don't know. Maybe it's just an interesting story. Do you know him?" Daniel shook his head. "I had never thought about that country, much less about Buddhist temples." That night, in his apartment, he looked at the book suspiciously. He didn't believe in destiny, but the coincidence was disturbing to him. Finally, with some reluctance, he began to read. The days passed, and Daniel tried to immerse himself in his routine to forget the matter. However, the coincidences continued to appear. One morning on the subway, while he was checking his email on his phone, two people were talking next to him. "You said you went to Thailand, right?" "Yes, to Wat Phao Luang Tabua Temple. It is an impressive place." Daniel looked up immediately. His heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. Not only was it the same country, but the exact same temple that the book mentioned. He tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence. The world was big, but the amount of information circulating was enormous. His brain was simply biased, looking for patterns where there were none. However, the more he tried to ignore it, the louder reality seemed to scream at him. During an office meeting, while his boss talked about investing in emerging markets, Daniel could barely concentrate. His mind was divided between his structured life and that absurd sequence of coincidences. At the end of the day, he was left alone in his office, looking out the window at the illuminated buildings. Why did all this bother him so much? It was a feeling of discomfort, of lack of control. Like something was pushing him somewhere he didn't want to go. He knew his mind was trying to find a logical explanation, a rational pattern. But deep down, what worried him most was the idea that perhaps there was no rational explanation. Daniel closed the book with a snap and left it on the table in his apartment. "I didn't want to continue reading. I couldn't. This was all nonsense. Coincidences meant nothing. He was a man of numbers, of statistics, of probabilities. He knew that the human brain had a tendency to look for patterns even where there were none. He repeated it over and over like a mantra. It's just a coincidence, nothing more. And so he decided to ignore it. The next few days passed like any other. Meetings, calls, emails. Everything was the same as always, except it wasn't true. There was a constant discomfort within him, a background noise in his mind that he couldn't silence, no matter how hard he tried to get lost in work. He felt like he was acting in a play, repeating a script that no longer made sense. At night, in his silent apartment, he found himself restless. She felt the urge to review the book that Marcos had given her, but she forced herself not to. "I'm not going to get caught up in this nonsense." To assert himself, he looked for data to support it. He read articles about apophenia, the brain's tendency to see patterns where there are none. He watched documentaries about how magical thinking could fool even the most rational minds. He became convinced that all this was a product of his stress and fatigue. Nothing else. And yet, the discomfort persisted. One night, while organizing his library, he found a wooden box on the top of a shelf. It was an object he hadn't touched in years, one he had unconsciously avoided. Inside were some of his father's few belongings. Daniel remained silent, observing the photos and the objects inside. His father had died when he was 15, leaving him with an absence that he had never allowed himself to fully process. While going through the objects, he found one photograph in particular. His father, as a young man, smiled in an exotic landscape that Daniel did not recognize. But what struck him the most was not the image itself, but the pendant he wore around his neck. It was a symbol carved in metal, a design that seemed strangely familiar. With her pulse racing, she looked for her phone and took the book that Marcos had given her. He flipped through it until he found a picture of the Thai temple it mentioned. And there it was, the same symbol, identical to the one his father was wearing in the photograph. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. What did this mean? His father had never talked about Thailand. He didn't remember any stories, any mention of that country in his childhood. And yet, there was the proof. Her first impulse was to reject him. There had to be an explanation. Maybe his father had bought that pendant somewhere else. Maybe it just looked like the temple symbol, but it wasn't the same. He repeated these excuses over and over again, but deep down he knew they were not convincing. He sat on the floor, holding the photo between his fingers, feeling something inside him crack. Maybe he had spent his entire life believing he could control everything through reason. Perhaps he had built such a high wall between himself and the inexplicable that he had never seen what really mattered. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have a clear answer, just questions, and that terrified him. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned in bed, changed positions, tried to distract himself with his phone, but nothing was working. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of his father with the pendant. The same symbol that appeared in the book, the same temple that he had heard on the subway. It was too much of a coincidence. Finally, he gave up and sat on the bed. He turned on his laptop, opened the browser, and began searching for information about the click. Download to save Wat Fa Luang Tabua MP3 YouTube.com. The first results led him to images of the temple, a golden structure in the middle of the jungle, surrounded by orange-robed monks and tigers wandering peacefully among them. It wasn't what I expected, but what really caught his attention was something deeper. The temple was associated with the teaching of Dharma and the search for personal purpose through introspection. And among the articles he read, there was one that made him hold his breath. Synchronicity, when the universe speaks to you. Daniel knew Carl Jung, not because he was interested in psychology, but because in college he had read about his theories for a consumer behavior course. Jung was talking about archetypes, the collective unconscious, and something that at that time he had discarded as pseudoscience, synchronicity. According to Jung, synchronicity occurred when two or more apparently unconnected events acquired meaning in a person's life. It was not simple chance, but a kind of dialogue with the universe. The answers are where you least expect them. The memory of that phrase he had seen on television reappeared in his mind. What if for a moment he stopped resisting the idea? What if his father was, in some way, leaving him a message through these events? He shook his head and slammed the laptop shut. No, I couldn't go on with this. I was starting to sound like a lunatic. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office with a frown and a persistent headache. He needed to focus on something real, something tangible, but the universe seemed to have other plans. During lunch, his colleague Santiago, an executive with whom he worked in international investments, casually commented to him, "Next week I travel to Asia to close a deal with a fund in Singapore. After that, I'll take a few days in Thailand." Daniel stopped eating. Thailand? Yes, I want to see the temples and relax a little. You should come. Daniel laughed in disbelief. I am not one of those who travel without reason. Santiago shrugged his shoulders. Maybe that's why you should do it. Daniel felt a chill. It was ridiculous. He couldn't leave his job, his routine, his orderly life. But what would happen if I said yes? That night, Daniel found himself staring at a photo of his father. Why did he have that pendant? Why didn't he ever talk about it? And above all, why did he feel like all of this was pushing him in a direction he didn't want to take? For the first time in his life, he was faced with a decision he couldn't calculate. If he accepted the invitation, he would face the unknown. If he rejected her, he might never find out the truth. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that perhaps logic didn't have all the answers. The plane ticket was in his hands, but Daniel still couldn't believe that he had actually bought it. It's just a trip, it doesn't mean anything, he repeated to himself as he closed his suitcase with almost surgical precision. I had planned everything possible. The flight itinerary, the hotels, even the exact time I would spend in each place before returning to normal. If he was going to do this, he would at least make sure it was as rational as possible. But deep down, I knew there was a part of this experience I couldn't control, and that terrified him. While waiting at the gate, he checked his phone compulsively. Emails, news, market quotes, anything to distract himself from the uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. But then, without looking for it, his gaze fell on a nearby screen. A documentary channel broadcast an image of a Buddhist monk in meditation. Below, a sentence in subtitles read, "Life begins when you leave your comfort zone." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He sighed and looked away. It was just another coincidence. Already on the plane, Daniel took his seat next to the window. He was relieved to see that the seat next to him was still empty. Hopefully, no one will sit here, he thought. But just as he was settling down, a woman with brown hair and vibrant eyes appeared next to him. Hello. It seems that we will be traveling companions, he said with a broad smile as he put away his backpack. Daniel barely looked up. Yeah, I guess. The woman extended her hand. I'm Lena. Daniel shook her reluctantly. Daniel. She had no interest in conversation. But Lena seemed to be the type of person who didn't take no for an answer. Are you traveling for business or pleasure? He asked as the plane began to move down the runway. Daniel hesitated. Don't know. Lena raised an eyebrow curiously. Interesting. That means it's something important. Nobody travels without a reason. He gave a dry laugh. Believe me, there are people who simply travel to travel. Yes, but even they are looking for something, even if they don't know it. Daniel didn't respond. He just looked out the window as the plane took off. After the fasten seatbelt signal went off, Lena took out a leather notebook and began to write. Travel diary? Daniel asked without much intention of continuing the talk. Something like that. I write about the signs I find along the way. Daniel frowned. Signs? Yes, synchronicities. Coincidences that are not really coincidences. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. Let me guess. You think the universe sends us messages, right? Lena smiled. It's not about what I believe. It's about what I experience. Daniel crossed his arms. I prefer the facts. Lena leaned slightly towards him. What if the facts you ignore are the most important? That phrase threw him off. For the first time in his life, someone was questioning his way of thinking without sounding illogical or naive. It was as if Lena was used to talking to skeptics like him. Hours later, as the plane flew over the ocean, Daniel closed his eyes trying to sleep. But in his mind, Lena's words continued to echo. What if the facts you ignore are the most important ones? It was an idea he couldn't get out of his head, and I had a feeling this trip was about to challenge everything I thought I knew about life. The air in Thailand was thick and warm, heavy with the smells of incense, spices, and something else that was harder to define. Daniel got out of the tuk-tuk and stood motionless for a moment, observing the entrance to the temple. Click download to save Wat File Wong de Bua MP3 YouTube.com. There was something imposing about him, something that made him feel small. The golden roofs glistened with sunlight, and the sounds of Buddhist chanting floated through the air, enveloping him in an atmosphere that seemed strangely familiar to him, even though he had never set foot in such a place. He clenched his fists and took a deep breath. It's just a temple, nothing more. But then, he felt something unexpected, a strange sensation, as if it had been there before. He walked slowly through the temple, watching the monks who passed by in silence. Their orange robes contrasted with the dark wood of the hallways and the Buddha statues. I didn't understand why it was there, or rather, I didn't understand why I felt like I should be there. As he tried to process his thoughts, an old monk approached him with calm steps. His wrinkled skin and deep gaze gave the impression of someone who had seen more than he could say with words. The monk looked at him curiously, as if he could see something in him that Daniel himself could not perceive. The answers you seek have already arrived, but you have not seen them. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Sorry? He asked in disbelief. The monk smiled serenely. You look for something that has always been with you. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. The monk bowed his head and walked away slowly, leaving him with a tangle of thoughts that were impossible to sort out. What the hell just happened? That night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the monk's phrase. The answers you seek have already arrived, but you have not seen them. What did that mean? For the first time in years, instead of analyzing it logically, he let the words float through his mind without trying to dissect them. And then, his memory took him back to his childhood. He remembered his father, a silent man but with a look that always hid something. She remembered the time she found him holding the pendant in his hands, looking at it longingly. What is that? Dad? Daniel had asked when he was barely 8 years old. His father looked at him, surprised, and then smiled sadly. It is a memory of another time. Daniel never asked more, and his father never mentioned it again. But now, after all the coincidences, after the symbol repeated at different times in his life, he began to wonder if his father had left a hidden message in his silence, one he had never allowed himself to see. Daniel exhaled deeply and laid back on his hotel bed. For the first time in his life, he felt his mind open to the possibility that things were not just what they seemed. Maybe the synchronicity was not simple chance. Maybe his father had left him clues without words. And maybe this trip was more important than he had imagined. Exhaustion finally overcame Daniel, and he fell asleep. But that was not a normal night. In the gloom of his subconscious, the past began to emerge, as if the veil of time was torn apart. Daniel saw himself as a child, sitting in the living room of his house. The warm afternoon light streamed through the curtains, illuminating the dust particles in the air. In front of him was his father, holding in his hand the pendant with the symbol of the temple. Some things in life don't have a logical explanation. Danny, little Daniel frowned. That sounds silly, Dad. There is always a reason for everything. His father smiled melancholy. That's what I also believed when I was young. But then, something changed. The adult Daniel, trapped inside the dream, watched the scene with anguish. What changed, Dad? Tell me. But the boy he once was just shrugged and changed the subject. Uninterested. The image faded and the scene changed. Now it was a rainy night. Daniel, about 13 years old, listened to the murmurs of his parents arguing in the other room. You can't continue with this. You have to tell him the truth, her mother demanded in a low but firm voice. He won't understand. Not yet, answered his father. What if it's never ready? What if you die without me knowing? Daniel's heart pounded, but before I could hear more, the dream changed again. Now he was in a hospital. The sound of the monitors, the smell of disinfectant, the cold of the room. His father was in bed, pale, weak. Daniel, 17 years old, sat next to him. unable to hold his gaze. "I'm sorry, son," his father whispered, his voice broken. Daniel held back his tears. "Don't talk like that. You're going to get better." His father just smiled sadly. "Not everything can be explained. Danny, someday you will understand." The monitor gave a long beep, and everything went dark. Daniel's eyes snapped open. Gasping, he was back in his hotel room. The air conditioning humming softly in the background. His heart was beating as if he had run for miles. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the moisture of sweat. He hadn't thought about his father's death in years. He had buried that pain under layers of rationality, logic, distractions. But now here in Thailand, with all those memories surfacing, he felt something he didn't want to admit. A void, a hole inside him that he had tried to fill with professional success, with routine, with absolute control over his life. But no matter how much I planned, how much I tried to ignore it, his father's shadow was still there. And with it, all the unanswered questions. He got out of bed and walked to the bathroom mirror. He looked at his reflection for the first time. He didn't see the rational, analytical man he had spent years building. He saw a confused boy to an angry teenager to an adult afraid to face what he had avoided all his life. Carl Jung said that the shadow was the part of us that we repress, that which we deny because we are too scared to see it in front of us. Daniel had always rejected spirituality, intuition, everything that could not be proven with facts. But now he was wondering, have I been ignoring the truth all this time? He ran his hand through his hair and exhaled sharply. This journey wasn't just taking him to a temple, it was taking him deep inside himself, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what he would find. The dawn in Thailand bathed the city in a golden light, but in Daniel's mind the storm reigned. He couldn't stop thinking about his dream. In the words of his father, in all the coincidences that had led him there. He sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the moment. His rationality told him that everything was just coincidence, that his mind was creating connections where there were none. But deep inside him, something was beginning to doubt. What if all those coincidences weren't chance? What if they were actually signs? He dressed without haste and went down to the hotel cafe. I needed to clear my mind. He ordered a black coffee and sat by a window. The bustle of the street reminded him that the world was moving on. Indifferent to his thoughts, he took out his phone and started making a mental list of all the coincidences that had happened. The book with the history of the temple. Hear the name of the temple in the subway. Find your father's photo with the same temple symbol. A monk telling him that the answers had already arrived. The dream about his father and the words he never understood. It was too much. If each of those things had happened separately, maybe I wouldn't have thought about it twice. But together, there was something else. A pattern. A kind of invisible thread connecting everything. He took a sip of his coffee, feeling the caffeine awaken his senses. If I want answers, I have to start by understanding what the hell synchronicity is. He opened his laptop and started reading about Carl Jung. He had heard the name before, but had never really been interested in his work. The first thing he found was a definition: synchronicity, the significant coincidence between external events and internal states, without an obvious cause and effect relationship. Daniel frowned. Coincidences that have meaning? How is it possible that two events with no logical connection can be related? He continued reading. Jung believed that synchronicity occurred when the unconscious manifested itself in reality. It was a way in which the psyche communicated with the outside world. It was not about magic or superstition, but about a deep relationship between the mind and reality. Daniel exhaled slowly. If this is true, does it mean that my unconscious is guiding me? He felt uncomfortable. All his life, he had built his identity around logic, numbers, facts. But now, for the first time, He was considering the possibility that there was something beyond reason, something that his father seemed to have understood, and that he had ignored for years. He closed the laptop and looked around. Things seemed the same. The coffee was still hot. The sound of cars was still there. But inside, something had changed. For the first time in his life, his logic did not give him a clear answer. And that terrified him. But it also intrigued him. Maybe, just maybe, the time had come to stop looking for answers in the usual places and start listening to what your intuition had to say. The sun was at its highest point when Daniel arrived back at the temple. The majestic architecture, the gentle chanting of the monks, and the aroma of incense were less foreign to him than the day before, but something inside him remained restless. He had read about Yom and Synchronicity. He had begun to doubt his skepticism, but he still needed proof, something tangible. I couldn't accept that all this was happening for no real reason. If my father really knew something, I need to find answers. And then, fate or synchronicity played its next card. Daniel was walking through the temple gardens when an elderly monk, with a shaved head and worn robes, stopped in front of him. His face was furrowed by deep wrinkles, but his eyes had a vibrant energy. "I've been waiting for you, Daniel." A chill ran down his spine. "How do you know my name?" he asked, feeling his rationality shake a little more. The monk smiled calmly and pointed to a small, wooden pavilion in the shade of a leafy tree. "Come. There is something you should know." Daniel followed him in silence. When they sat down, the old man looked at him intensely, as if he could see beyond his skin, beyond his mind, and then he spoke the words that would shatter everything Daniel believed. "Your father also came here." The air seemed to grow heavier. What do you mean?" Daniel whispered, feeling his stomach contract. The old man rested his hands on his knees calmly. "Many years ago, a man with the same pendant as yours came to this temple. I was looking for answers, just like you." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. His father, I had been there, in that same place, asking the same questions as him. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" he asked with a broken voice. The monk bowed his head in understanding. "Some answers are too heavy to share, but there's something you should know." He paused, as if choosing his words precisely. "Your father never finished his search." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel felt the ground beneath his feet tremble, although in reality, everything remained the same. "What does that mean?" "It means that you are here to finish what he could. Single quotes. Daniel leaned on the wooden table, feeling the weight of those words. Was it possible? Was their journey more than just a series of coincidences? Since he was a child, he had felt that his father kept secrets. He had ignored the signs. He had taken refuge in logic to avoid facing the unknown. But now, in that temple, with a monk who spoke of his father as if he had known him personally, the reality was beginning to become too clear. This trip was no coincidence. It was a second chance, a cycle that had to be closed. Daniel swallowed and looked at the old man with a new resolve in his eyes. "Tell me what I need to do," the monk smiled. "First, you must stop looking for answers outside and start looking for them inside." The sound of the wind brushing the leaves of the temple, the murmur of the monks in prayer, the aroma of incense floating in the air. Daniel had never paid attention to those small details. But now, sitting in front of the old man who had revealed the truth about his father, everything seemed different. For the first time in his life, instead of analyzing, instead of rationalizing, he simply noticed and felt. Daniel had spent his entire life trying to make sense of everything. Numbers, patterns, logic, forecast. He had built his identity around certainty, the belief that everything had a rational explanation. But now, faced with the inexplicable, he realized a truth that shook him to the core. Maybe life doesn't always need to be understood. Sometimes it just needs to be lived. He took a deep breath and looked at the old man. "I have always believed that the world moves by cause and effect. that things happen because they must happen. But now, he paused, choosing his words. Now I'm not so sure. The old man nodded with a light smile. That's good. Certainty is a very subtle prison. Daniel frowned. How can I trust something I can't prove? The old man picked up a leaf from the ground and held it in his open palm. Look at this sheet. Do you trust that he will fall when his time is up? Daniel looked at the sheet in silence. I guess so. Do you need proof to know? Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. The old man smiled. Some truths don't need proof, just acceptance. That night, Daniel sat on the balcony of his room in the temple. He looked at the starry sky and tried to remember the last time he had simply looked without purpose, without counting time, without thinking about what would come next. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel. He felt the cold wind against his skin. He felt his lungs expand with each breath. He felt his heartbeat. It was the first time. I wasn't trying to decipher his life. I just was living, and for the first time in a long time. He felt peace. The next morning, Daniel found the old man again in the temple gardens. She sat next to him in silence. There were no questions this time. There were no doubts to resolve. It was just there. Present. The old man looked at him with satisfaction. Today, you have learned the most important lesson. Daniel turned his face towards him. Which? The old man smiled. Not everything in life needs answers. For the first time, Daniel didn't try to argue. He didn't try to analyze. He just smiled. And he accepted the inexplicable. The plane landed softly at the airport, but Daniel felt like something inside him had not touched the ground yet. He looked out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance. Familiar but strange at the same time. He had left that place with a mind full of certainties and an empty heart. Now he returned with a peaceful mind and a full heart. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in his life, he understood that he didn't need them. As he picked up his luggage, he observed the people around him. Before, all of this would have been routine. Airports, itineraries, planning, but now I noticed things that I didn't see before. The elderly couple holding hands in the waiting room. A boy laughing with his mother while they played with a bottle of water. The businesswoman who, despite her stiff appearance, looked at a photo on her phone with a wistful expression. Nothing had changed, but he does. Leaving the airport, he took a taxi. The driver turned on the radio and Daniel let himself be carried away by the music. The streets of the city passed before his eyes, and for a moment, he felt a glimpse of his old life wanting to take over him. The control, the need for answers, the constant struggle to understand everything. But then, as he stopped at a traffic light, something caught his attention. An advertising billboard, illuminated by the light of a street lamp. In white letters, on a blue background, read a phrase that made his heart stop for a moment. Sometimes the answers are where you least expect them. The same words he heard on television that day in the office. The day it all began. The universe had spoken to him again. Daniel smiled, because now understood. He entered his apartment, put his suitcase aside, and stood in the middle of the living room. Everything was the same. But at the same time, everything was different. He approached his desk, where the old photo of his father with the temple pendant still rested. He took it in his hands and looked at it. With a new look, there were no more questions. Just gratitude. His father never finished his journey, but he does. And in that moment, Daniel knew that, no matter where life took him, he would always find the answers the moment he was ready to see them. He closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. And for the first time in his life, he felt free. Daniel's image slowly fades. Now the viewer is no longer watching his story. Now, the focus is on themselves. City lights shine in the background. The hum of traffic sounds distant. A voiceover, calm but deep, breaks the silence. What if the coincidences in your life were signs? Think about the time something unexpected came your way. A song on the radio with a message just when you needed it. A book recommended by someone without knowing what you were going through. A person who entered your life at the exact moment. Were they simple coincidences? Or were they answers you weren't ready to see? Carl Jung called this synchronicity, the connection of events that, although they seem random, have a deeper meaning. Maybe the universe doesn't run on logic alone. Perhaps, in moments of greatest uncertainty, the answers surround us, waiting for us to see them. But we can only see them when we are open to feel them. The camera slowly zooms in on the night city, the lights of the cars, the illuminated buildings, life in constant movement, ... And then the voice asks, how many signs have you ignored because you were too busy looking elsewhere for answers? What if today, right now, there was a sign in front of you? Are you ready to see it? Only one last sentence appears on the screen. The answers have always been there. You just need to open your eyes.